Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a great honor to present to you a bold vision of a new political architecture in Central and Southeastern Europe. It's a vision that was devised, formulated 5 years ago by a group of Czech experienced politicians, intellectuals, businessmen and experts in various strategic areas that were anticipating fundamental shifts on the global political scene. At first, many people looked at us as dreamers who were out of touch with reality. But history proved us right. The changes that are currently taking place, not only in Europe, herald the birth of a new epoch, and with it, new international order. That's why many of those who have been looking at our project with a certain amount of caution or skepticism are now changing their minds and showing interest in closer cooperation. Before I explain what this cooperation consists of, let me first introduce some of the basic philosophical premises of our initiative. But first, a few words about why we chose Saint Adalbert. He was a martyr from the 10th century. Why did we choose him as the patron of our association and our political vision? It was he who, in addition to promoting a balanced and harmonious cooperation between secular and spiritual powers, sought to create the conditions for the emergence of authentically sovereign states in Central Europe, bound together by a closer bond of reciprocity and cooperation to face together the problems of their time. He was also instrumental in ensuring that these newly formed entities overcame the downsides of paganism through a peaceful process of Christianization that led to their later cultural and social flourishing. This legacy, the legacy of Saint Adalbert, is worth remembering at a time when the political situation in Europe and the world at large is beginning to significantly change. We are entering a new era, an era of new conflicts that are going to affect the future of our region for a long time. We see world powers preparing their positions to create new zones of influence. And we are witnessing growing tensions within the European Union that will lead to its disintegration. We are at a moment, historical moment, when the countries of Central and Southeastern Europe do not yet have a defined place by the great powers. A time when we can, to a large degree, decide the fate of our own nations by ourselves, to lay the foundations for our own political self-determination. And we, my colleagues at Patrimonium, are deeply convinced that history and the circumstances of current developments clearly show that a closer form of cooperation between the countries of this vast region of Central and Southeastern Europe is the most promising way for the preservation of our identity and further developments of our nations. And this is not only because of the need to recognize and face the newly emerging role of Russia, but mainly because of the moral and spiritual decline of the West, which threatens the very foundations of our Christian culture and civilization. The explosive mixture of aggressive progressivism and the infiltration of inimical forces especially from countries dominated by Islam, poses an existential threat, both culturally and demographically, to our Western neighbors. It's not only the phenomenon of mass migration that threatens our quality of life, but also the self-destructive submission to the ideology of climate and environmental alarmism, which is harming Europe economically. The nations of Central and Southeastern Europe, thanks to their cultural proximity and their shared historical experiences, including some recent ones, most of them were affected by the communist totalitarianism, which makes these societies more receptive and hopefully more resilient to the self-destructive ideology of political correctness and liberal progressivism. These societies have an obligation today to give priority to what unites them over what divides them. Obviously, our nations never lived in isolation, have been linked by countless relationships over the centuries, and have faced many external threats together. And that is why the total independence of states in Europe, and in this region in particular, that's an unrealistic illusion. Mutual cooperation is simply a necessity. On the other hand, the natural competitiveness of its nations is an age-old source of Europe's dynamism and vitality, and any pressure for ethnic, political, and economic unification or the suppression of national identities is simply suicidal. That is why we're not calling for some kind of federalization of Central Europe, mimicking on a smaller scale the centralized super-state structure pushed by the bureaucrats. We're basically proposing a kind of intergovernmental entity of a much looser architecture, not subject to a common and permanent center of power presiding over the participating countries. So just to be clear, we're not proposing to establish a Central European Commission, Central European Parliament, Central European Court of Justice, nothing of that sort. But more about that later, about this constitutional, the broader constitutional framework in the presentation of my colleague David Trust. Every state, including this loose union of Central European nations, cannot exist in a value vacuum. The European Union likes to refer to European values, whatever that means. But these have very little in common with the ideas and philosophical principles on which European culture and civilization has stood for centuries. Our vision of future Central European cooperation is based on principles and virtues that have been inherent in Europe before the late modern triumph of liberalism. That is patriotism, protection of the natural family, intergenerational solidarity, respect for human life from one's conception to natural death. Why is this important? It's simple because, besides the obvious moral considerations, only pro-family and pro-natal societies have a future. It is futile to lament the demographic transformation of our societies caused by the undeterred mass migration when our own population infected by hedonism becomes, symbolically and not just symbolically, becomes sterile. And we strongly believe that our nations, that the peoples of Central and Southeastern Europe have the potential, despite all the ideological pressure coming from the postmodern Western elites, to keep these values alive. A healthy value orientation of our Central European region is not an end in itself. But once it is well grounded, will be reflected in a whole range of other areas, in the social, health, or education policies but also will boost the country's economic productivity. It will also have a positive impact in the field of defense, both internally and externally. Obviously, it's certainly easier to motivate someone who is firmly rooted in the traditional morality and to love and defend his country than a person who is not even clear what sex he is. We greatly appreciate the fact that we closely cooperate with partners in Bulgaria in laying grounds for the future realization of this vision. Even though this project was launched in Prague, it was conceived as a joint enterprise of all Central and Southeastern European nations, through associations and initiatives working in them. Today we have partner organizations in 10 countries that are very active. And now it's really up to each of us to convince the political establishment and other relevant actors in our nations of the need for a common direction that is neither, geopolitically speaking, Eastern nor Western, but our own, that is specifically and distinctively Central European. And our deep conviction, I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues from the Czech Republic, our deep conviction is that Bulgaria has to play a very important role in the realization of this. It's daring, but from the perspective of our future as independent, sovereign, and non-progressive nations and states, it's a self-preserving vision. We very much look forward to the cooperation and to see many of you at our regular international conference that will be held in Prague the last weekend of October. This will be another special opportunity for us and you to meet with some eminent personalities from all over Central and Southeastern Europe and to further deepen our friendship. What seemed like an unrealistic dream to many of us just a few years ago when we organized our first conference is also, thanks to your efforts, becoming viable. So let me finish. Finish by brief with thanking you for your kind hospitality and this opportunity to establish new friendships, to broaden our cooperation, to broaden the rank of our collaborators. Neka všichni, da ste dobré, Bůh da blagoslaví Bulgárii.